The glamorous look for almost all young women to aspire to in the America of the turn of the last century, no matter their social class, was the Gibson girl. Illustrator Charles Dana Gibson created this look to represent the supposedly ideal young woman of that pre-World War I era. She was required to be slender and poised and pouty and athletic, but with a big, ample bosom, an impossibly tiny waist, and big, impossibly poofy hair. Gibson's artwork, and that of many imitators, was featured on the covers of, and also used for ads and story illustrations in, magazines and newspapers, and elsewhere, such as these two Gibson covers from 1902 and 1913. You don't hear the name much these days unless you happen to visit Disneyland or Magic Kingdom at Walt Disney World. Both have a Gibson Girl ice cream parlor, since Main Street is a highly fictionalized version of an early 1900s small-town Main Street. A while back, I showed my 40-something daughter Ramona the earlier Bathing Beauties picture and asked if she had heard of Gibson girls like these. Ramona had indeed heard of Gibson girls, but not from a history book. She knew of them because the term was used in the 1987 Anne of Green Gables TV movie Anne of Avonlea, which was set in that time period. One character exclaimed to Anne, who had her hair piled on her head in the way we've seen in Gibson's illustrations, that she looked just like a Gibson girl. I bring this up because when not wearing a dress with a plunging neckline to show off her ample bosom, the typical Gibson girl and Gibson girl wannabe would wear a long flared skirt and a shirtwaist. Shirtwaist, sometimes shortened to just the word waist, was a term for a woman's blouse, usually with a collar, often a stand-up one, long poofy sleeves with cuffs, and a button-down front, as you see on this 1899 sketch by Gibson of a lady golfer, and on this group of high school girls from 1910. Washing and ironing clothes was a real hassle back then, before automatic washing machines and dryers, electric irons, and permapress fabrics. So I would suppose it would be very practical to have a closet full of blouses to change every day, to go with a few skirts, which could go longer between washings and ironings. If you were a young woman or a young woman's mother who was handy with a needle and thread, or maybe even had a treadle sewing machine, you could make your own shirtwaists using a pattern like this one from McCall's. But a significant portion of the women in the land had neither the skill to sew such fashions nor a treadle machine. And I would guess that the average middle and upper class woman would look down on having to sew clothing for herself or her daughters anyway. So they would go to the local department store shirtwaist department, or check their latest Sears catalog for shirtwaists, such as this catalog from 1909. Lawn isn't used here to indicate where you'd wear them. Lawn was a type of lightweight, delicate linen material popular for blouses back at that time. And thus they might end up purchasing a mass-produced shirtwaist like this one, which was manufactured at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in Manhattan, New York in about 1910. But few aspiring Gibson girls had the slightest idea under what conditions their lovely, delicate shirtwaists were made, or by whom. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory occupied the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors of this 10-story building in downtown Manhattan. Here is a photo of a workroom at that factory in about 1910. Although there were some men employed in the factory, they were mostly hired to cut the cloth. It was the 500 or so women employed there who did the actual sewing. So what was it like to work there? The workday was 14 hours long with only one short break throughout the day. Extra bathroom breaks were often denied, forcing some workers to urinate on the factory room floor, adding to the already unsanitary workspace. Ventilation was poor, and doors to the factory rooms were typically kept locked during working hours, ostensibly to cut down on petty theft by workers who might try to leave unnoticed with something stuffed in their purses, and to keep anyone from sneaking out to hallways or stairways to take an unauthorized break. Heaping piles of flammable fabric scraps littered the factory room floors. The typical salary was $2 or $3 a day, but seamstresses were required to pay for the needles and thread they consumed, and their pay was docked for any errors they made when sewing. If they pricked a finger and got blood on fabric, they were fined. If they did it a second time, they were fired. On some days, they could be docked more than they were paid. In June 1909, a fire prevention specialist sent a letter to the owners of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory to discuss ways to improve safety in the factory. The letter was ignored. At the end of September 1909, with the encouragement of Local 25 of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory workers went out on strike, seeking increased wages, reduced working hours, and union representation. Conditions were no better at similar factories. Unrest was spreading throughout the ladies' garment-making industry in New York. On November 22, 1909, young Jewish activist Clara Lemlich, 23 years old and only 5 foot 4 inches tall, spoke out boldly at a union meeting that they must do something. Here is the English translation of the Yiddish words she spoke that day. I have listened to all the speakers, and I have no further patience for talk. I am a working girl, one of those striking against intolerable conditions. I am tired of listening to speakers who talk in generalities. What we are here for is to decide whether or not to strike. I make a motion that we go out in a general strike. And the other women listened and acted. On November 24, 1909, in the largest single work stoppage of women in U.S. history up to that time, 20,000 workers walked off the job in an industry-wide strike, joining the already striking Triangle workers. They demanded better wages, a shorter, standardized workday, improved working conditions, and union representation. Almost all of the women involved in this strike were recent immigrants, either Jewish or Italian. Notice the Yiddish writing on the signboard in one of their protest marches. Being part of the strike was dangerous. Factory owners tried to intimidate the striking workers by bringing in prostitutes to fight with the young women on the picket lines. And if that wasn't bad enough, it's even said that at times they hired ex-prize fighters to pick fights with them. They also bribed local policemen, who arrested any strikers who fought back at the agitators and dragged them off to court bloodied and bandaged, where bribed judges found workers guilty. 700 of the women Clara Lemlich led on the strike were arrested. 19 were sent to labor camps. At first, few people in the general public paid any attention, and the newspapers barely mentioned the strike. Until in December 1909, Anne Morgan, daughter of international financier J.P. Morgan, took up the workers' cause. She was joined by powerful socialite Alva Vanderbilt Belmont. With the voices of these rich upper-class women, known whimsically as the Mink Brigade, added to that of the strikers, by the middle of December, the media picked up on the story of the horrible working conditions. Within 48 hours, smaller businesses capitulated to the demands, and workers began to return to what were known as union-only workshops. Not so at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. Owners Max Blank and Isaac Harris were angry and indignant. Blank and Harris formed an association of the factory owners. By December 1909, they were engaged in negotiations with the strikers, offering increases in wages and improvements in working conditions, but stopped short of agreeing to allow the unions to organize in the factories. Workers refused, and the strike continued. Slowly, one by one, individual factory owners agreed to the demands of the workers, including union representation. But at Triangle, Harris and Blank would not allow a union to be formed in their organization. 5 months after they began their strike, on February 23, 1910, Triangle workers decided to accept increased wages and better hours. But they failed to get the much-coveted union representation. But they did get better hours and a bit of increase in wages. A cause for celebration, right? Yeah. That is, until 13 months later, on March 25, 1911, when the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory caught fire in one of the deadliest industrial disasters in the history of the city of New York. It resulted in the 4th highest loss of life from an industrial accident in U.S. history. It was also one of the deadliest disasters that ever occurred in New York City until the destruction of the World Trade Center 90 years later. The fire caused the deaths of 146 garment workers who died from the flames, smoke inhalation, or falling or jumping to their deaths from the windows of an upper story of the building. Most of the victims were recent Jewish and Italian immigrant women aged 16 to 23. Of the victims whose ages are known, the oldest victim was 43 and the youngest two were 14 years old. As the workday was ending on the afternoon of Saturday, March 25, 1911, a fire flared up at approximately 4:40 p.m. in a scrap bin under one of the cutter's tables at the northeast corner of the 8th floor. The first fire alarm was sent at 4:45 p.m. by a passerby on Washington Place, who saw smoke coming from the 8th floor. Both owners of the factory were in attendance and had invited their children to the factory on that afternoon. The fire marshal concluded that the likely cause of the fire was the disposal of an unextinguished match or cigarette butt in the scrap bin, which held 2 months' worth of accumulated cuttings by the time of the fire. Beneath the table in the wooden bin were hundreds of pounds of scraps, which were left over from the several thousand shirtwaists that had been cut at that table. A bookkeeper on the 8th floor was able to warn employees on the 10th floor via telephone, but there was no audible alarm and no way to contact staff on the 9th floor. According to one survivor, the first warning of the fire on the 9th floor arrived at the same time as the fire itself. Although the floor had a number of exits, including 2 freight elevators, a fire escape, and stairways down to 2 different streets, flames prevented workers from descending one stairway, and the door to the other stairway was locked. The foreman who held the stairway door key had already escaped by another route. Dozens of employees on some floors escaped the fire by going up one stairway to the roof, but within 3 minutes, the stairway became unusable in both directions. Other survivors were able to jam themselves into the elevators while they continued to operate, which wasn't long. Terrified employees crowded onto the single exterior fire escape, which city officials had allowed the building owner to erect instead of the required 3rd stairway. It was a flimsy and poorly anchored iron structure which may have been broken even before the fire. It soon twisted and collapsed from the heat and overload, spilling about 20 victims nearly 100 feet to their deaths on the pavement below. A large crowd of bystanders gathered on the street, witnessing 62 people jumping or falling to their deaths from the burning building. Another 80 workers waited until smoke and fire overcame them and died in the flames. The fire department arrived quickly, but the water from their hoses couldn't reach the upper floors to put out the flames, and their ladders only reached to the 6th floor, so there was no way to rescue those beyond that floor. The fallen bodies and falling victims also made it difficult for the fire department to even approach close to the building. It took only 18 minutes for the fire to race through the building, destroying everything in its path and taking so many lives. By the end of the day on March 25th, here's what some of those workrooms in the Triangle building looked like. There was a great outpouring of grief in New York City regarding the tragedy. The parade of mourning was viewed by close to 400,000 people standing in pouring rain along the route. And there was a widespread outcry for something to be done about holding those responsible accountable. But in the end, did anyone end up shouldering responsibility for this horror? Max Blank and Isaac Harris, who were in the Triangle factory when the fire started, survived by fleeing to the building's roof when the fire began. They were indicted on charges of first and second-degree manslaughter in mid-April, and their trial began on December 4th, 1911, and quickly ended with an acquittal for both. The defense lawyer convinced the jury that the prosecution needed to prove that the owners specifically knew that the exit doors were locked at the time of the fire, in spite of the fact that almost everyone knew that this was standard procedure for this sweatshop, without any question done with the approval of the owners. There was a subsequent civil trial, and the owners lost that one. The plaintiffs won $75 compensation to the survivors of each victim, which ended up being no sweat for Blank and Harris. Their insurance company ended up paying them about $60,000 over their reported losses. That comes out to about $400 per casualty. Yep, they came out way ahead. These jerks were not true big-time robber barons like John D. Rockefeller, of course. They were just petty, small-time, greedy men, part of a grander scheme of heartless capital and helpless, hapless labor in the land at the time. But surely the greedy jerks at least learned their lesson and dedicated the rest of their lives to factory safety out of a sense of guilt for so many innocent lives lost, didn't they? Ha! They immediately set up a new factory at a new location. Harris and Blank were to continue their defiant attitude toward the authorities. Just a few days after the fire, the new premises of their factory had been found not to be fireproof, without fire escapes, and without adequate exits. In August of 1913, Max Blank was charged with locking one of the doors of his factory during working hours. Brought to court, he was fined $20, and the judge apologized to him for the imposition. In December of 1913, the interior of his factory was found to be littered with rubbish piled 6 feet high, with scraps kept in non-regulation, flammable wicker baskets. This time, instead of a court appearance and a fine, he was served a stern warning. In 1914, Harris and Blank paid a fine when they were caught having seamstresses sew fake Consumers League labels into their garments. The real League labels were specifically intended to certify that the items had been manufactured under good workplace conditions. The Triangle Waste Company was to cease operations in 1918, but the owners maintained throughout that their factory was a, quote, model of cleanliness and sanitary conditions, unquote, and that it was, quote, second to none in the country, unquote. Oh, and Clara Lemlich, the leader of that industry-wide 1909 strike, she had a cousin who worked at the Triangle Shirt Factory. The cousin evidently survived the fire. For her outspoken union efforts, Clara was blacklisted from the garment industry. She then turned her efforts to the campaign for women's suffrage, to being a consumer advocate, and eventually to campaigns against nuclear weapons, against the Vietnam War, and for civil rights. She died in 1970 at age 96. You can even read a book about her many exploits. As a footnote to this story, I only recently discovered a silent film made by Thomas Edison's motion picture company in 1912 within months of the Triangle Fire. The plot is obviously a melodramatic fictionalized version of the Triangle tragedy. It opens with a scene in which a safety inspector sternly warns Mr. Waters, a factory owner, not to allow fire exits to be blocked. That is followed by a scene in which Waters sternly chastises employee Tom Watts for smoking, pointing out the positively no smoking sign right next to the factory door. When Waters leaves, Tom lights up in the factory basement and carelessly tosses a match away. This starts a fire in the basement, which races up the stairs to engulf the whole factory. All the fire exits are blocked, trapping all the employees. Only when Tom chops a hole in a wall with a fire axe do they escape. But Tom's fiancée, Hilda, had passed out from the smoke inhalation earlier, and no one noticed until they had all escaped from the building. Tom then dashes back into the building and carries her out. No one is killed in this version of the tragedy, but Hilda is crippled by her injuries. In the aftermath, all the employees lose work until the factory can be rebuilt. But in the implications of this retelling, almost all responsibility for the fire and its aftermath is removed from Waters for his criminal neglect of even the most rudimentary safety regulations for the factory, and is placed instead on the momentary carelessness of Tom, who tossed a match. Note the title of the film, The Crime of Carelessness. When the other employees learn who tossed the match, they berate and shun Tom. There's no hint at all in the film that any of the employees put any blame at all on Waters for allowing the fire exits to be blocked. Only when Hilda confronts Waters near the end of the film and suggests that he shares the blame for her injuries does Waters indicate the slightest pangs of guilt for the situation. He is shown magnanimously offering Tom his job at the factory back, but there are no repercussions shown at all for Waters related to the flagrant violations of safety regulations. In the end, the film is painfully, obviously, a piece of pro-industrialist propaganda intended to shift public perception of the responsibility for worker safety almost totally onto the laborers toiling in the factories, making it an issue of those laborers just carefully following every rule they are given, and to blithely minimize and whitewash the seriousness of the blatant safety violations that many, if not most, business owners of that era, such as the owners of the Triangle Factory, were obviously guilty of. In light of this, you may not be surprised to find out who bankrolled the movie. Yes, it's a propaganda piece commissioned by the National Association of Manufacturers. The period of the industrialization of America that exploded after the Civil War, with the rise of huge corporations led by robber barons, led directly to the conditions among the working classes of the early 1900s, typified by the Triangle Shirtwaist factory strike and subsequent fire. And in spite of pop culture names that glossed over the various parts of the period in later years, such as gay 90s, for vast portions of the population, nothing about it was gay or refreshing. Growing even more rapidly than the general population, which almost doubled between 1870 and 1900, the industrial labor force expanded to more than a third of the population by the end of the century. A rough economic profile from the end of the 1880s indicates how close to the margin of poverty many workers were compelled to live. About 45% of the industrial laborers barely held on above the $500 per year poverty line. About 40% lived below the line of tolerable existence, surviving in shabby tenements and rundown neighborhoods by dint of income eked out by working wives and children. About a fourth of those below the poverty line lived in actual destitution. A small group of highly skilled workers were capable of earning from $800 to $1,100 a year. The common daily pay for unskilled labor remained about $1.50. Moreover, hardships were exacerbated by periods of high unemployment, as much as 16%, during the depressions of the mid-1870s and mid-1880s. As you might guess, this led to continual labor unrest. The 1880s witnessed almost 10,000 strikes and lockouts. Close to 700,000 workers went out in 1886 alone. And it wasn't just long hours and low pay that concerned them. Hazards to health and to life itself were common in the heavy metal industries, in textile factories, and in chemical plants. The railroad industry took a particularly horrible toll. There were 72,000 employees killed on the tracks between 1890 and 1917, and close to 2 million injured. Another 158,000 killed in repair shops and roundhouses. Workmen's compensation did not appear until the 1930s, and railroad disability insurance not until 1947. Brakemen performed especially hazardous work. They had to ride the tops of freight cars in all weather, from rainstorms to blizzards, for as long as it took to travel their 100-mile route. Sometimes railroaders were required to go right back out on another run, working 20 or 30 hours straight. The toll of death and injury was great, as it was in many mining and industrial occupations. And it wasn't just adults who were toiling under miserable conditions and constant threat of death or serious injury. It has been estimated that by 1910, 2 million children in the U.S. under the age of 15 were working at industrial jobs. At times, their work could even be more miserable and dangerous than that of adults, since employers typically took advantage of their smaller size and forced them to squeeze into tight, dangerous spaces. Faced with back-breaking labor and long, exhausting shifts, fatigued child workers suffered high accident rates. Those who were injured or maimed in the course of their duties often received no compensation. This is Giles in 1912, age 11. While working in a spinning mill in North Carolina, a piece of machinery fell on his foot, mashing his toe. This caused him to fall onto a spinning machine, and his hand went into unprotected gearing, crushing and tearing out 2 fingers. His aunt said, "Now he's just got to where he could be of some help to his ma, and then this happens, and he can't never work no more like he oughter." This is Frank, whose legs were cut off by a motor car in a coal mine in West Virginia when he was 14. This is Neil, who lost his leg in an accident in a Pennsylvania mine at the age of 13. This is Luther, 14 years old. His right arm had been cut off by a veneering saw in a box factory in Cincinnati. There's no doubt that all these kids were working to help keep their families from total destitution, because here is the reality of the economic situation in the U.S. around the turn of the last century. In 1890, out of 12 million families, 11 million lived on incomes below $1,200 a year. The average income of this group was $380, far below the accepted poverty line. In the population as a whole, the richest 1% earned more than the total income of the poorest 50% and commanded more wealth than the remaining 99%. Yes, the Victorian era had its own 1%. It was somewhat easy for that 1% to ignore the unwashed masses right up to World War I. Oh, the masses occasionally stirred up a fuss with one of those tens of thousands of strikes against factories, sweatshops, mines, or mills, but the effects of those didn't reach into the enclaves of mansions and estates where the 1% lived. Farther down the economic ladder from the 1%, the middle class was seldom supportive of any kind of strikes, as they were a bit closer to the front lines of unrest. The marches and sometimes boisterous public rallies in the streets by strikers were scary and upset the sensibilities of the middle class. They had a strong need for an unquestioned law and order. So they were often, by nature, anti-labor when it came to disputes between employers and laborers. And the governmental authorities at local, state, and national levels were decidedly unsupportive of any disturbance of the law and order, almost always siding against labor, to the point of sending in the state militias or even federal troops to quell labor unrest with brute force and violence if necessary. Strikes sometimes succeeded in getting minor victories for workers, a pittance more pay, a tiny adjustment of hours worked, but most of the time with no improvement in safety conditions, as is clear with the Triangle Fire example. But as soon as each strike was over and the headlines in the newspapers quit talking about them, the industrialists and the 1% and the middle class promptly went back to not worrying about them. Until the Russian Revolution. At that point, the narrative changed drastically, both as expressed by the national press and the government. It seems that from that point on, the aristocratic part of the American populace began worrying that the forces of Russian communism, the Bolsheviks, that wiped out the aristocracy of Russia, including the assassination of the royal family, whose mansions and estates didn't protect them, were headed directly to America's shores. In fact, had already arrived and were infiltrating the nation. This sense of things was exacerbated immediately after the end of the World War. Many working-class men who had labored in decent jobs in bustling wartime industries in America to back up the war effort suddenly found those jobs disappearing as the nation demobilized. And what was worse, the labor market was suddenly inundated by millions of working-class men coming back from the European war to find no jobs waiting for them. Jobs were scarce, employers could fill any needs they had easily, with no need to cater to anyone complaining about long hours, low wages, or unsafe conditions. Gripers could be replaced instantly with others eager to get any work at all. When this led to labor unrest and strikes all across the country, suddenly it was easier to blame not the hellish working conditions and starvation wages, but agitation by communists. If those fiendish Bolsheviks could just be ferreted out and deported back to wherever they came from, and any hapless converts among American citizens they made while here could be incarcerated and deprogrammed, the masses could go back to quietly suffering instead of being so belligerent. Take the Boston police, for instance. Both the public and the government of Boston seemed stunned when almost the entire Boston police force voted to go out on strike on September 9th, 1919. This is a crowd of Boston police leaving the meeting where they voted to strike. Note how young so many looked. Many were World War I veterans with young families. They had demanded recognition for their trade union and improvements in wages and working conditions. But the police commissioner had denied that police officers had any right to form a union, much less one affiliated with a larger organization like the American Federation of Labor. Attempts at reconciliation between the commissioner and the police officers, particularly on the part of Boston's mayor, failed. During the strike, Boston experienced several nights of lawlessness, although property damage was not extensive. Massachusetts Governor Calvin Coolidge called up several thousand members of the state guard, and, along with volunteers, order was restored to the city. Press reaction, both locally and nationally, described the strike as Bolshevik-inspired and directed at the destruction of civil society. All of the events were spun into a communist plot. Now we wait for Lenin and Trotsky, wrote the Wall Street Journal. Governor Coolidge referred to the striking policemen as deserters and agents of Lenin. A mass meeting of the Boston Police Union drafted a response to the governor's comments. When we were honorably discharged from the United States Army, we were hailed as heroes and saviors of our country. We returned to our duties on the police force of Boston. Now, though only a few months have passed, we are denounced as deserters, as traitors to our city, and violators of our oath of office. The first men to raise the cry were those who have always been opposed to giving labor a living wage. It was taken up by the newspapers, who cared little for the real facts. You, Governor Coolidge, finally added your word of condemnation. Among us are men who have gone against spitting machine guns single-handed and captured them, volunteering for the job. Among us are men who have ridden with dispatches through shell fire so dense that 4 men fell and only the 5th got through. Not one man of us ever disgraced the flag or his service. It is bitter to come home and be called deserters and traitors. We are the same men who were on the French front. Some of us fought in the Spanish War of 1898. Won't you tell the people of Massachusetts in which war you, Coolidge, served? Coolidge, who indeed had never served in the military, was no doubt particularly miffed at this slam at his masculinity and patriotism. You might think police work wouldn't be a good example of hellish working conditions such as could be found in the mines and factories, until you find out the details of the life of the Boston cop of the time. In 1918, the salary for a new recruit was $730 a year. After 6 years, the patrolman would make only $1,400 a year. Police officers had to buy their own uniforms and equipment, which cost over $200. In the years following World War I, inflation dramatically eroded the value of a police officer's salary. From 1913 to May 1919, the cost of living rose by 76%, while police wages rose just 18%. Discontent among the Boston police force grew as they compared their wages and found they were earning less than an unskilled steel worker, half as much as a carpenter or mechanic, and 50 cents a day less than a streetcar conductor. Patrolmen worked a 7-day week with 1 day off every 15 days. Patrolmen who worked the day shift put in 73 hours a week, and nightmen worked 83 hours a week, while paddy wagon men worked 98 hours. After a day off, the men were required to serve a house day, which meant they were on call at the station from 8 a.m. until 6 p.m., performing various tasks such as recording duty, wagon runs, and attending to the signal desk. After a 3-hour break, they reported back to the station at 9 p.m., where they slept for 3 hours until midnight, at which time the bell rang for roll call and they went out on the street until 8 a.m. After that, they could go home, but they had to be back at 6 p.m. for what they called an evening on the floor, which meant performing the same type of duties such as taking care of prisoners, wagon trips, or whatever turned up. At 9 p.m., the patrolman went back to bed for 3 hours. Although the commissioner and mayor had agreed to give the police a 24-hour holiday for every 8 days of work, this could be taken away at will, and often was. And even during his free time, a patrolman could not leave the city limits without express permission. According to one patrolman, that was the way it was day after day, round after round. We had no freedom, no home life at all. We couldn't even go to Revere Beach without the captain's permission. Revere Beach was the first public beach in the United States, founded in 1895. It was only 4 miles north of downtown Boston and a popular refreshment spot for Bostonians, particularly among the working classes. You could easily get there by a dedicated small narrow-gauge railway, by ferry, or by auto if you were affluent enough to afford your own wheels. It was much like Atlantic City in New Jersey, with a boardwalk, sandy beach for sunning, wading, and swimming, or ogling the bathing beauties, such as the group called the Peekaboos, shown here in 1919. A dance pavilion, roller skating rink, a midway with amusement games and rides, bathhouses, and many food concessions. But it sounds like the average steel worker or streetcar conductor got to enjoy an outing there more often than the average policeman. Maybe the policeman's chances were better to ask for permission in the slow crime season of winter. You could still get to Revere Beach then, but not many bathing beauties to ogle. Yes, life was pretty bleak for the Boston police of 1919. They complained about having to share beds and the lack of sanitation, baths, and toilets at many of the 19 station houses where they were required to live, most of which dated to before the Civil War. The Court Street station had 4 toilets for 135 men and 1 bathtub. They didn't get black lung disease like miners, nor physically risk life and limb all day long every day like many in the steel mills, but it sure sounds to me like a pretty miserable working life. But no, the federal government, the press, and the upper echelons of the Boston government couldn't possibly conceive that these conditions would be enough to rebel against. Surely it was just that there were sneaky Russian Bolsheviks stirring them up to not appreciate what they had. The police strike ended on September 13th when Commissioner Curtis announced the replacement of all striking workers with 1,500 new officers who were given higher wages. The strike proved to be a setback for labor unions. The AFL discontinued its attempts to organize police officers for another 2 decades, and they didn't succeed in organizing a police union clear until 1965. Coolidge's tough stance against the police strike gave him a national reputation as a decisive man of action, which led to him winning the Republican nomination for Vice President of the U.S. in the 1920 presidential election with Warren Harding. And his handling of the strike ultimately thrust him into the role of U.S. President when Harding died in 1923 and Coolidge succeeded him. So the answer to fight the influence of Bolshevism wasn't to remove the actual reasons for complaints about the extreme inequities of the capitalist system in America. It wasn't to encourage all employers, including the city of Boston, to turn over a new leaf and give a living wage and honest day's pay for an honest day's work under safe, sane, civilized working conditions, with the opportunity for employees to actually have a little bit of pursuit of happiness in a life outside work. No, the answer was to find an outside force that was causing the wheels of the country to not run smoothly and quietly like they should, so that the American aristocracy and the American middle class would not be inconvenienced. A report from Washington, D.C. about the Boston police strike included this headline and article lead-in. Senators think effort to Sovietize the government is started. Senator Henry Cabot Lodge saw in the strike the dangers of the national labor movement. If the American Federation of Labor succeeds in getting hold of the police in Boston, it will go all over the country, and we shall be in measurable distance of Soviet government by labor unions. And thus began what is nowadays referred to as the First Red Scare. I don't know about you, but until recent times, whenever I heard the historical term Red Scare, I immediately thought of this man, Senator Joseph P. McCarthy. I had always understood that the Red Scare was an era in America that began shortly after World War II, when Russia turned from being an ally who helped defeat Hitler to a deadly foe of the United States that suddenly turned on us, developed its own atomic weapons, and engaged us in a horrific arms race that threatened to blow up the whole earth. The term Reds was a nickname for the Russian Communist Party. Russia, led by that party, was believed to be bent, just like Hitler had been, on taking over the whole world, and the United States was its biggest prey. Very quickly after the Russians exploded their first atomic bomb in 1949, it was assumed by many that the communist Russians, the Reds, had been busily infiltrating the U.S. government to steal our atomic and other military secrets. And at the same time, it was assumed that they had the ultimate intention of infiltrating all aspects of American society, particularly the American working man's unions, in order to agitate the dissatisfaction of workers with the American capitalist system. The fear was that such infiltration was greatly widespread, and that nefarious plans were being laid for an actual revolution of the U.S. working class, similar to that of the 1917 Russian Revolution, which would overturn the U.S. government and the U.S. economic system. The resultant chaos would allow the Russians to put a puppet government in place and, in essence, make the U.S. a vassal state of the USSR. These fears led to an almost mania in much of society about the looming threat of communism, leading early on to the efforts of Congressman Joseph P. McCarthy. This, in turn, let loose a whole cottage industry of books, comic books, motion pictures, pamphlets, and more on the theme of Russian infiltration and takeover. Yes, this was what I understood to be the period of the Red Scare. Only recently did I come to understand that this paranoia about a takeover of the U.S. by Russian communism was not a new phenomenon at all. It was instead the resurrection of a very old phenomenon that began in 1919. This is an ominous poster advertising a silent motion picture from 1919 that was a direct product of what I now know was the first Red Scare. Although the term communism was used widely at the time, when used in reference to the possibility of a communist takeover of the U.S. government, economy, and society, back then the preferred term was Bolshevism. The communists in Russia at the time of the Russian Revolution were divided into a number of different parties, the two primary ones being the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. The Russian term Bolshevik means majority, Menshevik means minority. Once the revolution was underway, infighting among the parties eventually led to a complete takeover by the Bolsheviks. In the U.S., the term Bolshevism became a synonym for the kind of communism espoused by the Russian Bolsheviks headed by Lenin. In later years, the term fell out of use in the United States, and the terms communists and communism were used in reference to the Russian threat against America. No, the first Red Scare was not a fear of a military takeover by Russia, as many feared in the 1950s. Russia's military power was in a shambles after the World War and in no position to make war with America, and the various factions in Russia were engaged from 1917 to 1922 in a violent civil war that was to establish who was to wield ultimate power in their land. They had no time or resources to dedicate to an overseas war. Americans in 1919 were not scared of the military power of the bickering and warring factions in Russia. The anxiety and fear was that the ideology of Bolshevik communism was being exported to America and would be used to lead to an uprising of the peasant and worker classes to bring the American royalty to its knees and destroy the American capitalist economic system. The war years had deeply affected the U.S. economy. For instance, compared to 1915, food prices had doubled by 1920, clothing costs more than tripled. The necessity to gear up for war production had quickly led to a boom in factory jobs and wages, and demobilization at the end of the war had just as quickly deflated the boom, leaving many without work. The employment situation was desperately exacerbated by the return of over 4 million soldiers coming back from Europe who would immediately need employment, many of them so physically mangled by their war experiences that it was even more difficult for them to find work. Add to this the so-called Great Migration of Southern African Americans to the North, where wages were typically 3 times what they could get from doing farm work in the rural South. That had begun before the outbreak of World War I, but intensified in 1914. By 1919, over 1 million had swarmed into industrial centers like Detroit, where the black population jumped up 600% from 1910 to 1920, and Philadelphia, where it was 500% higher. Jobs were easy for them to find in the war years, but so easy to lose once the war was over. When workers were desperately needed during the wartime, employers overlooked their own racial prejudices and that of their white employees and hired blacks. But once the war was over, many blacks found themselves the first to be laid off or unceremoniously replaced by new white applicants. The same was true for both black and white women, many of whom found good paying work during the war with so many men drafted into the service, and who were just as unceremoniously replaced by male whites as soon as the war was over. And thus, competition for jobs and impatience with miserable working conditions, long hours, and unfair labor practices led to an astonishing outbreak of strikes in 1919. Over 4 million workers, 1/5 of the nation's workforce, participated in strikes in 1919, including 365,000 steelworkers and 400,000 miners. The number of striking workers would not be matched until the Depression year of 1937. Even the Actors' Equity Union, which consisted of everyone from silent motion picture projection machine operators to such famous entertainers as W.C. Fields and Lionel Barrymore, went on strike in 1919, shutting down all the plays on Broadway. The armistice ending World War I had been signed in November 1918, and within just a few weeks, the first major strike hit the country. In January 1919, unions in the Seattle, Washington shipbuilding industry demanded a pay increase for unskilled workers. The shipyard owners, wanting to cause discord in the union, responded by offering an increase only to skilled workers. The union rejected that offer, and Seattle's 35,000 shipyard workers went on strike on January 21st. Meanwhile, the head of a federal agency that contracted with shipyard companies for building ships for the U.S. government sent a telegram to the Metal Trades Association, the Association of Shipyard Owners, threatening them that the government would withdraw contracts if any increase in wages were granted. Well, that agency head thought he'd sent the telegram to the Metal Trades Association, but the local telegraph company got the address garbled and delivered the telegram instead to the Metal Trades Council, which was the headquarters of the Shipyard Workers Union. Union leaders and members were enraged that the telegram made it obvious that the government was totally siding with the employers, and they immediately appealed to the Seattle Central Labor Council to call for a general strike of all workers in Seattle. Over 100 local unions, representing all sorts of workers, from milk delivery men to garbage collectors to trolley conductors, almost unanimously supported the call for the general strike. It began on February 6th and basically shut down the city of Seattle. The unions were able to organize amazingly well to make sure that the impact of the strike on the community was not a great burden to the lower classes of the city, especially the strikers themselves. A general strike committee set up soup kitchens and distributed as many as 30,000 meals each day. Strikers paid 25 cents per meal, and the general public paid 35 cents. Beef stew, spaghetti, bread, and coffee were offered on an all-you-can-eat basis. Garbage that would create a health hazard was collected. Laundry workers continued to handle hospital laundry, and firemen remained on duty. Army veterans created an alternative to the police in order to maintain order. A group called the Labor War Veterans Guard forbade the use of force and did not carry weapons, and used persuasion only. Amazingly, the regular police forces made no arrests in actions related to the strike, and general arrests dropped to less than half their normal number. To deal with possible violence expected during the strike, Ole Hansen, the mayor of Seattle, had federal troops available and stationed 950 sailors and Marines across the city. He added 600 men to the police force and hired and provided guns to 2,400 special deputies, students from the University of Washington for the most part. On the second day of the strike, he threatened to use 1,500 police and 1,500 troops to replace striking workers, but he never made good on the threat. It was soon obvious that the mayor, along with many in the press and in the middle classes, were convinced that the strike was part of a nefarious plot created by Bolsheviks to overthrow the government of Seattle and ultimately the U.S. federal government. At the beginning of the strike, the local Seattle Star newspaper had this to say: "The general strike is at hand, and more, a general showdown is at hand. A showdown for all of us, a test of Americanism, a test of your Americanism. As the Star stated yesterday, this is no time to mince words. A part of our community is in fact defying our government, and is in fact contemplating changing that government, and not by American methods. This small part of our city talks plainly of taking over things, of resuming under our management. We call this thing that is upon us a general strike, but it is more than that. It is to be an acid test of American citizenship, an acid test for all those principles for which our soldiers have fought and died. It is to determine whether this is a country worth living in and a country worth dying for. The challenge is right up to you, men and women of Seattle. Under which flag do you stand?" And as the strike ended, the Star made it even clearer how certain it was that the whole strike situation had nothing to do with actual working conditions and salaries and such, but could be attributed solely to outside agitators who hated America, commenting in part, "Just as the American part of Seattle labor stood by Seattle in the World War test, so that American part of Seattle labor will come through again. They are coming through. Temporarily misled by a gang of criminal un-American leaders, Seattle union labor can be depended upon not only to repudiate that false leadership, but to see to it that the punishment goes with the repudiation. And on the other hand, Seattle's American labor can depend upon it that the rest of Seattle will stand by them. Seattle must be an American city. It must be made free of Bolsheviks and Bolshevism. Under the American system, law and order are recognized. The American method is the use of the ballot. The Bolshevik method is the use of the torch." During the strike, the mayor told reporters in no uncertain terms that any man who attempts to take over the control of the municipal government functions will be shot. No such overthrow attempt came, though. National leaders of the AFL became very worried that this general strike would set back their unionizing efforts for a long time, so they began exerting pressure on the Seattle unions to back down. One by one, various local union members began going back to work, and by February 11th, the General Strike Committee voted to end the strike. Immediately following the strike's end, Mayor Hansen took credit for ending the strike and was hailed by some of the press. He resigned a few months later and toured the country, giving lectures on the dangers of what he termed domestic Bolshevism, offering for sale his book on the topic. His lectures provided him 5 times what his income as mayor had been. Other strikes sprang up around the country throughout the spring and summer. The Boston police strike began on September 9th, and the largest, most tumultuous strike involving the greatest number of workers began in Chicago just 2 days later on September 11th. About 350,000 steelworkers in 24 separate unions went on strike as part of a drive by the American Federation of Labor to unionize the industry. Steel industry leaders were convinced that this was the first step towards a Bolshevik-style revolution to overturn the capitalist industrial system. But if it was led by totally incompetent Bolsheviks, with no backing by some powerful international movement. The strike ended with the complete defeat of the unions. The government and much of the non-striking population of the U.S. chose to basically ignore the real roots of the 1919 strikes, the grueling lives of the workers, the rock-bottom wages and unfair labor practices of many owners of industries, the insecurity and danger of many of the jobs performed by those choosing to go on strike. No, instead of looking at real problems and considering real solutions that would alleviate those problems, the solution of choice was to assume it was just outside agitators, communists and socialists in particular, who had put foolish notions in the head of the workers. The solution on behalf of some governmental authorities, along with the popular press, was to stir up a nationwide Red Scare to give the populace a tangible enemy to focus on. For some reason, many in government, the mass media, and citizens in the upper and middle classes of America had a difficult time conceiving that striking workers might have honest, legitimate, deep concerns about poverty-level wages and miserable and dangerous or even deadly working conditions. They just wanted folks like those naughty, striking coal miners to get back to work so the inconvenience caused by strikes and protest marches would stop. Yes, outside influences such as communist agitators could exacerbate the legitimate concerns of the workers, but the solution to that problem ought to have been to work towards fixing what was wrong, negotiating fair wages and humane working conditions, putting the welfare of the workers on an equal level of importance with high profits for corporate leaders and stockholders would assure that the outsiders had no foothold. But sending armed police and state militia and National Guard troops to threaten and beat striking workers into submission and force them back to work had long been a quicker and cheaper fix. Of course, after each strike was put down by such methods, the industrialists of America avoided talking about the causes of the strike or about the often violent methods that had brought it to an end. They indulged instead in public relations messages like this one from 1919 instead, aimed not at the workers, but at the privileged classes who needed to be reassured that there was no need for the inconvenience caused by strikes. This ad included these claims about American business and industry, quote, "Our workers are well paid, and many of them own their own homes. Employers and employees are getting closer together, and the workers are participating in industrial affairs more and more every day," unquote. Try telling that to the faces of the desperate striking laborers of 1919. This video docu-commentary is being created in the summer of 2019. This year is the centennial of that critical summer in our country's history. Many online articles on news sites from around the country are featuring special centennial articles on what has often been dubbed by historians as the Red Summer of 1919. Given all the emphasis on the Red Scare that we've discussed to this point, red being the color of the Soviet Union flag and thus the nickname for communists, you'd think that these references to Red Summer would be a reference to that kind of red. It's not. The term Red Summer in this case refers to another crisis that hit America in that same critical year. It is a reference to blood. It refers to the summer and early autumn of 1919, which was marked by hundreds of deaths and many casualties across the United States as a result of lynchings and race riots that occurred in more than 36 cities and one rural county. Starting in the late 1960s, when reading about race riots in American newspapers, one usually expected the stories to be about militant African Americans in metropolitan areas engaging in massive public disturbances, including violence against people and property, in protest of perceived civil rights injustices that they were convinced remained unsolved by earlier nonviolent methods of Martin Luther King. What a significant portion of Americans in the 21st century don't realize is this. Historically, much earlier in the century, the term race riot was used in reports in the U.S. media to describe something very different. A race riot in the late 1800s and early 1900s was almost exclusively a situation in which large groups of angry whites indiscriminately attacked those of the Negro race, killing or injuring many, destroying their property, and in some cases completely driving all blacks out of a given neighborhood, county, town, or city. Incidents of such riots had been increasing all across the country in the late 1800s and early 1900s, such as this infamous incident in Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898. They came to a head in the red summer of 1919. Actually, it wasn't just in the summer in 1919 that blood was shed. Between January 1st and September 14th, 1919, white mobs lynched at least 43 African Americans, with 16 hanged and others shot, while another 8 men were burned at the stake. Most of these lynchings, such as this one in Mississippi, were very public spectacles viewed by from hundreds to many thousands of men, women, and sometimes children. Professional and amateur photographers often took photos of the goings-on, and before the day was out would print up souvenir postcards for folks to buy to send to friends and family or keep in their own photo albums. The crowd at this lynching in September 1919 in downtown Omaha, Nebraska, was estimated to be well over 10,000. Actor Henry Fonda, 14 at the time, about the age you see him in this photo, viewed the situation in horror with his father from the window of a nearby office building, and the images haunted him for the rest of his life. From statements in the media, the public was encouraged to believe that the local and state police and local authorities were powerless to interfere in such ghoulish displays, such as this claim by the governor of Mississippi in June 1919 that he was just powerless to prevent the lynching shown earlier that was literally scheduled to be held in Ellisville, Mississippi at 5 p.m. on June 26th. Newspaper reports estimated that a crowd of 10,000 came from far and wide to watch the Holocaust. The reality, of course, is that the local or state authorities were most often totally uninterested in intervening. In fact, local police were often directly involved in the lynchings. Poignantly, none of this, including the burnings and postcards, was new. Such atrocities had continued unabated since Reconstruction times, such as this incident in Paris, Texas in 1893. It's just that there was an extremely unusual cluster of such lynchings in 1919, at the same time as the numerous so-called race riots. Here's just one example of more than 36 race riots that occurred that year. Starting July 27th, the summer's greatest violence occurred during rioting in Chicago. The city's beaches along Lake Michigan were segregated by custom. Eugene Williams, a black youth, swam into an area on the south side customarily used by whites, was stoned by onlookers, and drowned. When the Chicago police refused to take action against the attackers, young black men responded violently. Whites then attacked a whole black area of Southside Chicago. The resulting 38 fatalities included 23 black people and 15 whites. The injured totaled 537, hundreds of black businesses were destroyed, and 1,000 or so black families were left homeless. Illinois called in a militia force of 3,500 men to restore order. So, what was the response of the U.S. government to this and other such race riots and the many lynchings of blacks in the summer of 1919? Authorities viewed with alarm African Americans' advocacy of racial equality, labor rights, or the rights of victims of mobs to defend themselves. Unlike earlier race riots in U.S. history, the 1919 events were among the first in which black people in number resisted white attacks and fought back. Why might the authorities view this with alarm? Perhaps they were responding to the attitude at the very top of the government about Negro soldiers returning from service in the war in Europe. In a private conversation in March 1919, President Woodrow Wilson said that, quote, "The American Negro returning from abroad would be our greatest medium in conveying Bolshevism to America." Yes, the fact that Negroes might physically resist being lynched or resist with force having their neighborhoods burned to the ground couldn't possibly be because they had legitimate concerns about these things. It had to be that they were just stirred up by outside agitators. For hadn't they always, up until the time of the Russian Revolution, just meekly accepted abuse? And why might Wilson and others worry about Negroes who had been immersed in the European War? Well, American Negroes serving in the American Armed Services were only allowed to perform menial jobs, such as cooking and janitorial work. But if they happened to end up in France, like Eugene Bullard, shown here, that would mean they may have been exposed to French society, which had no Jim Crow laws. Why, the French even welcomed blacks to serve in their armed forces in actual armed military positions, including such roles as airplane gunners. They even gave heroes awards to some American blacks who served with them. And thus it was logical to worry that such Negroes might be open to arguments by European agitators, encourage them to protest the American way of dealing with the Negro American citizens when they returned to the United States. The reality is that there was much in the U.S. in 1919 that would remind anyone who had eyes wide open of conditions in the old world under feudalism. So it is no wonder that there was concern that revolutionary attitudes might be creeping into the lower echelons of American society. Since those in power and authority in the land were deeply entrenched in maintaining the way things had always been done, including Jim Crow laws and customs, and totally unfettered capitalism, there was no chance of any real societal changes. Instituting equal rights for Negroes and introducing truly widespread, meaningful changes in wages and working conditions in big industry were not on the table as possible solutions. What to do? What to do? Why, of course, the logical solution left for those wanting to maintain the status quo and suppress the disruption of strikes and racial unrest was to create a straw man enemy who could draw the attention of the masses away from demanding any practical solutions to actual problems. It was necessary to manufacture an ogre. You may remember ogres from reading Grimm's fairy tales. They are the huge humanoid beasts who like to devour regular humans, especially babies and children. Like this child-eating ogre created in the 16th century, featured in a fountain in Bern, Switzerland. The fountain's name, translated into English from Swiss German, is the Fountain of the Eater of Little Children. More specifically, American politicians and capitalists needed to manufacture the reputation that such an already existing ogre from Europe was an imminent threat to America the Beautiful. Just a couple of years before, the presentation of propaganda against a ready-made European ogre helped pull the nation together to be willing to take part in the bloody war raging in Europe. You'll notice that these anti-German World War I posters didn't just create antagonism toward the government of Germany or against the Kaiser of Germany. The purpose of the propaganda in these posters was to create a white-hot rage within Americans towards German society as a whole, dubbed the Hun. The propaganda was so effective that Americans with German family backgrounds, or even just German-sounding names, all came under suspicion, even from friends and neighbors they had known for years. It got so bad that even the little lovable dachshund dog, often used as another symbol for Germany in anti-German propaganda posters, fell out of favor in the U.S. for years. Because, of course, the German Kaiser himself had often been photographed with his own 3 dachshunds. But as quickly as the German Hun became the ogre of choice in U.S. propaganda, the war was over, and Germans became our friends once again, until the next round of German aggression. No, in 1919, there was no way to blame the Germans, who were busy trying to rebuild their own country from the devastation of the Great War, for current events in the U.S. By the way, in case you have an odd feeling that you've seen that Mad Brute Hun poster somewhere before, your subconscious mind may well be remembering this classic poster. I've little doubt that the illustrator who created the 1933 King Kong poster took as his inspiration that World War I propaganda poster from 1917. Could it possibly be that the strikes and riots in 1919 reflected real problems in American society? Nah, no way. Some outside force had to be involved. or at least it was necessary for the sake of the public good that one be identified and made the focus of attention. A description of a new monstrous ogre needed to be manufactured, and then its reputation spread far and wide. The choice was obvious. Whether referred to as Bolshevism or communism, the American public needed to be convinced that the American way of life and the prosperity bestowed on the population by the American system of unfettered capitalism was under threat by this foreign ogre and his minions secretly invading our land and seducing the unwary. The intense national media attention focused on the strikes and racial unrest in the Red Summer of 1919, and speculation on its connection to radical elements such as Bolsheviks, gave one man all the raw materials he needed to manufacture that custom-made ogre to present to the nation as the source of all unrest and upheaval. We'll meet that man in the next episode of this series. If I hadn't explained that this is all taking place clear back in the second decade of the 1900s, you might have expected that I would say that this man, Joseph McCarthy, was the one who created this ogre. For in fact, old Joe did embrace the use of this ogre for his own purposes in the early 1950s. But no, Joe had just resurrected the same exact ogre out of a slumber from an earlier time to meet the needs of his own era. Perhaps you're like me. For many years, I thought that once Joe made a fool out of himself and was censured by Congress in 1954 and died an early death in ignominy in 1957 at age 47, and after the Cold War with the USSR ended with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and then the dissolving of the USSR in 1991, and particularly after Russia itself even abandoned the old communism of its youth and its leader became best buds with the U.S. president, that this American manufactured ogre had finally seen his last days as a convenient scapegoat to take attention away from the greed and gluttony of the 1%, from the continuing problems of racial injustice in America, and from the failures of unfettered capitalism, that he'd wandered off into the sunset. If so, you may have been surprised in the last 5 years or so to see the epithet communist thrown at American politicians in an attempt to discredit them in the eyes of Americans and paint them as a threat to America. What's that all about? The mudslingers can't be meaning the Russian communist threat of the McCarthy era. They can't even be meaning the general threat from the nation of Russia, since the current president and many of those in his political party have been crawling in bed with Russian interests for several years now. The reality is that the word communist, in the context it is currently being used, isn't intended at all to raise a specter of a Russian takeover. And it isn't intended at all to raise the specter of a revolution among the lower classes in the way it meant in the early 1900s. It is a code word that has been encrusted with a lot of subconscious implications over the years by a certain subset of American leaders in politics and business to use as a tool to advance their own interests. You might even say it has become a dog whistle. In the way the term states' rights was used in speeches by politicians like Ronald Reagan in the 1980s to court bigoted potential Southern supporters because they knew it really meant racial prejudice. Only this new dog whistle, the word communism in its latest highly evolved incarnation, is aimed in particular directly at evangelical Christians. We'll explore more about how this phenomenon has developed in the last century and how it eventually became a key missing ingredient in the strange brew of politicians, big business, and conservative evangelical Christians that led to the election of Donald Trump in 2016, and may well play a significant part in the election of 2020 in the next entry in this series, Manufacturing an Ogre.